Hello, I'm Stephen Doherty, Director of Education and Testing here at Kaplan Medical. I want to talk to you today about the process of getting ready for your Step 2 exam. Now, our theme here is not content, things you have to learn, memorize, thought process. Instead, our theme here is how to understand the exam, what you need to do your best to get ready for that exam, and then we'll talk at the end about how we'd like you to structure your exam day. Now, I'm talking to you about getting ready for the exam, not from the point of view that I think you know nothing about study. Of course you do. You wouldn't have made it this far in your career unless you were actually already pretty good at getting ready for these kind of exams. Instead, I see my job sort of as a coach. Like any good coach, my job is to get you to stop in the middle of your study and just re-examine the fundamentals once again. So the challenge I want to start with is a relatively simple one. Don't simply tell me, this is what I do when I study. Let's take some time, look at what you do, and see how you can do it better. Everybody can get better at this. This is an essential skill you've been developing, and I want to help you develop it further, because if you know the content but can't show the content in the exam, that's a real problem. So, I'd like to begin with some simple basics, making sure everybody's fully informed about the basic structure and the timing issues for the Step 2 exam. I want to begin by making sure you understand some of the basic structure and the timing issues for the Step 2 CK exam. You all should know already that the Step 2 CK exam is a one-day exam at your local Prometric Center. Now, Prometric Centers, of course, are found all across the United States and all around the world. It's a one-day exam in which you will spend roughly 9 hours in the Prometric Center. 8 of those hours will be taking and handling test questions, and you'll have 45 minutes for break time. Now, it's important to realize that you only have 45 minutes for break time. That break time is time that you can use when you wish and how you wish, but you only have 45 minutes. Nobody will ring a bell and tell you it's time for lunch. Nobody will tap you on the shoulder and tell you it's time for bathroom break. You're going to have to manage your break time just like you have to manage your time on the questions. Now, under the old version of the software, something that used to be in place a couple of years ago, there was a gimmick that let you get excess break time. When you first start to take the exam, they ask you if you want to take the tutorial. If you say yes to the tutorial, and then did it very quickly under the old software, you would get that leftover time from the tutorial added to your break time. Well, I'm sorry, the world has changed. You can't do that anymore. Under the current structure, the 45 minutes of break time you start with is really the only break time you're going to have. The only way you can get any additional break time is if you finish a block of questions early, then that extra time from the block is added to your break time. That said, few people finish their blocks early, and those that do don't really have that much extra time. So you have that 45 minutes of break time you have to manage from the beginning. You're going to face 370 questions total under the current Step 2 CK exam. 370 questions. But you should know that you don't get these questions all at the same time. Questions come to you in blocks that can range from 43 to 50 questions. You can see when you start the block how many questions that we have within that block. The reason why the number of questions will, change around, modify, is because the question lengths of some will be longer, the question lengths of some will be shorter. And when we have a block that has a lot of long questions, they're going to give you fewer questions so that you have time to complete all the questions in the allocated time. If you have a block that has a lot more questions, well, then they're going to be relatively shorter questions. So when you open up the block and it says you have 43 questions, I know that sounds good because it sounds like you have fewer questions, but you have to anticipate those questions are going to be longer on average and take more time. When you open up a block and it says you have 50 questions, I know that sounds hard, but I also have to assure you the questions will be on average shorter, and so it will take you less time than estimate per question. You have 1 hour to do each block of questions, and you will only have 1 hour for each block of questions. There's no way to change that, and you will not have even a second over the 1 hour. Now, once again, some of you might have taken the exam previously or talked to people who took the exam in the past. Under an earlier version of the software, they actually gave you a little bit more than an hour, in the sense that if you won the very last question and the time in the block ran out, they would let you finish the question. Under the old software, you only got kicked out of the block when you exited a question. Yeah, once again, those days are gone. Under the current version of the software, they stop you, they kick you out of the block as soon as it's 60 minutes being done. That is, 60 minutes, the screen goes blank, and they then says, would you like to start the next block? It's important that you not be stunned when this happens to you, because it will happen. And it's also important, therefore, that you clearly manage your time going through the block of questions. You only have that 1 hour, and making sure you get used to that 1 hour is a crucial consideration. Can you change your answers? Yes, you can, but only in that 1 hour you have access to the block of questions. Once you close out a block of questions, you can no longer access it again. That is, if you're in the middle of block 2 and you suddenly remember the answer for that question in block 1, it's simply too late. A block that's closed is a block that is simply finished. You can't go back to it again. Now, within the block, within that hour, you can return to a question, reevaluate, and change your answer. So you can change your answers when you're within the block. Right. You can change your answers. But the real issue, of course, is should you change your answers? Now, every one of you has heard this 100 times before I'm going to say what I'm about to say next. On a multiple choice exam, you pick an answer and then you don't change it. Changing answers is one of the bad habits that everybody has. I had it myself when I was back taking these kind of exams, but it's a bad habit you must break yourself of. Changing answers over the long run, multiplied across the 370 questions you're going to see on the exam, will actually hurt your score. It drags you down. See, I need you to actually think about the exam that way. Not in terms of whether or not you get this individual question right, but in terms of putting behaviors in place that over the course of 370 questions maximizes what your score is going to be. I'd like you to think about the exam the way I do. It's a simple probability exercise. And the way you maximize your score is to do behaviors that when multiplied over the course of the exam increase your chances, and avoid behaviors that when multiplied over the course of the exam reduce your chances. Let's look at a simple probability here. Which has a higher chance of happening? Changing a right answer to a wrong answer, or wrong answer to a right answer? Well, that's obvious. A right answer to a wrong answer has the higher chance of happening. And by the way, what has the greatest chance of happening? Well, that's obvious again, changing one wrong answer to a different wrong answer. So however you think about it, if you just sit down and work the probabilities, changing answers actually works against you. Now, if that didn't convince you, let me try this. This exam is difficult enough that you have to use your whole brain. That means your logical left and also your intuitive right. You're going to get questions right. You're going to know the answer to questions, and you're not going to be able to know why. Now, don't feel bad, because medicine is practiced this way. Doctors walk in, they understand what's going on, they don't have the ability to articulate, but they're sure and they're right about their diagnosis or their intervention. Well, that's your intuitive side. And when you're changing answers, what you're essentially doing is you're chucking out your intuitive side and just trying to handle the exam by your simple logic and thought process. Logic, yes, is important. Thought process, crucial. But that intuitive side gives you valuable points you must use. Changing answers neglects that, and your score only suffers. Now, some of you change almost every answer. Some of you change every answer because you read down through the long question, you go down and you pick an answer, and then you realize, in all honesty, gee, I read that question stem really quickly. I didn't really think carefully. Let me go back and check it again. So now you go back and you read the question stem more carefully. And this time you go, oh my goodness, I missed this key piece of information. And now you go down and you change your answer. All right, the issue here is not that you should keep changing your answer. The issue is that your question answering strategy sucks. And the solution here is to get you to do the second time what you do the first time. In other words, if you find that you, quote, need to change your answer a lot, that's a good piece of data that the behavioral process you're using when you're answering the questions is inefficient and therefore inappropriate. We want you to go in, make a choice, and then have the courage or convictions and leave it in place. I'd like you to see every question, in fact, like it's a patient. You open the door, you walk in, you deal with the patient, and you walk out. In the real world, you won't say to a patient, I've done the testing and I've decided you have diabetes. No, I'm sorry, I'm cancer. No, I'm sorry, it's heart disease. In the real world, you will get the information, you'll talk to the patient having made the decision. And I want you to do the exam questions the same way. The thought process is simply parallel to how physicians have to be. Questions on the current Step 2 CK exam will not be adaptive. Now, do you have a clear sense what I mean when I talk about an adaptive exam? Let me explain just in case you're not quite so sure. In an adaptive exam, the questions you face will change based on your performance on previous questions. In an adaptive exam, if you do a block of questions and you do really well, the next block of questions you would face would be harder. If you do a block of questions and you don't do very well, the next block of questions you would face would be, well, easier. If you do a block of questions and you do about average, the next block of questions will be about average. And the exam will continue to calibrate itself as you move through the course of the exam. Now, the Step 2 exam, I say again, Step 2 CK, is not adaptive. Every question that you're going to face on the exam is from the pool of questions that were selected for you before you walk in to take the exam. They will not modify the questions you're going to face based on your performance. The exam does not get easier and does not get harder. And frankly, that's a little bit of shame, because an adaptive exam by simple mathematics is a cleaner, better measure of your capacities than just throwing a random 370 questions at you. You see, in an adaptive exam, they're going to score you based on how many questions you got right in conjunction with how difficult were the questions. In an adaptive exam, harder questions would get you more points and easier questions would get you fewer points. So if you did a block of hard questions, you have a smaller probability of getting them correct, but more points when you do so, for example. Now, in the current Step 2 CK exam, once again, it's not adaptive, and every question counts as much as every other question. It is not the case that certain questions count more. It's not the case that certain questions count less. Every question counts the same. Why do I keep saying the exam is not adaptive? Because many students walk out of the exam thinking that it is. In fact, some of you are going to walk out of the exam convinced that the exam was adaptive. Why? Because you're going to do a block of questions and it's going to seem, well, really hard. And then you're going to close that block of questions and open the next block of questions, and it's going to seem so much easier by comparison. And it's going to feel as if the exam is changing to match your performance. But I need to assure you once again, it is not. Here's why the exam seems adaptive. Question difficulty is essentially normally distributed on the exam. So think about a normal distribution, bell-shaped curve. Suppose they sample from that distribution and just by a random chance grab a set of questions for one of your blocks that turns out to be, well, harder than average. Well, that was a hard block, and you feel it's hard as you're going through it. And then they go back to the same distribution, and now they randomly sample to give you your second block. Well, considering that we took a lot of hard questions out of the distribution for the first block, what's left will be, relatively speaking, easier questions. And so that second block will be easier just by random chance. In other words, the exam will not adapt to you, but you will find it getting harder and easier as you move through the exam. I want you to think, therefore, about taking the exam not as running a race on a flat, level track, but as if you're doing, well, a marathon over hills and valleys. You're running uphill, it's hard, it's difficult. You're doing a difficult set of questions. But keep going, because as every marathon runner knows, when you're running uphill, there's a downhill coming. Your job's to keep going until the downhill comes to save you. By the same token, if you're going through a block of questions and you're really cruising, you're in the groove, everything seems easy, that's equivalent to you running downhill. Don't get cocky, because at the end of the downhill, there's an uphill coming. The exam does not adapt to you, but you will find it gets easier and harder on a random basis. And your job is to keep yourself mentally and emotionally involved as you cross the hills and valleys of the exam. In other words, when it seems really hard, keep going. I guarantee it's going to get easier. And when it seems really easy, keep going, but remember, it's going to get harder. That's simply the nature of the way the exam is structured. A passing score on the current Step 2 CK exam is now 182. 182. Now that is reviewed every 3 years. It's possible over the next several years that could change, but we don't have any indication that it will change anytime in the near future. 182. What does 182 mean? Well, we know from what the USMLE publishes that means you got between 60 and 70% of the questions correct. Wait, 60 to 70%. Which is it? Because come on, if you get, well, 65% of the questions correct, that really matters, right? You'll never know. You'll never know how many questions you got right, what percentage you got right, nor will you know the actual passing standard in percent for that given year. You simply won't know. Why? Well, the passing standard changes because they set the passing standard once a year based on a decision about what they call minimal competency level. Minimal competency level is based on two variables. One is the number of questions you got right, but two is overall question difficulty. So let's consider. Suppose you take the exam a year where the questions are, for everybody, on average, a little bit harder than average. Well then, 60% might be reasonable for passing. Or suppose you take the exam a year where the questions are, relatively speaking for everybody, easier than average. Well then, 70% makes more sense as a passing score. When they're trying to decide what the passing level is, they've taken into account the relative difficulty of the questions that are going to be used in the pool for that given year. They'll never tell you the number of questions you got right. They will never tell you the percentage of questions you got right. And you need to understand that's not to harm you, that's actually to help you. They want to make sure that a 182 is perceived as a 182 wherever the exam is taken and whenever the exam is taken. Whether you take it in the United States, outside the United States, whether a U.S. medical student or international medical graduate, the scoring and indeed the exam and the questions you face will be exactly the same. What they don't want to have happen is you might take the exam and get a fairly good score, and then you go to apply for residency, being happy to include that score in your application, and the program director looks at it and says, that's a really great score, but wait, that was the easy year for the exam. So the reason the scoring is hidden is not to harm you, it's actually to help you, to make sure that the score is the score is the score across years and across geographical distribution. You're going to get your results mailed to you in about 1 month afterwards. Now, we found that this sometimes comes sooner. You might find the envelope coming in about 3 weeks, but their target is to try to do this in about a 4-week period. Sometimes it can stretch to 5, sometimes of the year when a lot of people are taking it, it might stretch to 6, but you're basically going to take the exam and then you're going to walk away and wait till the envelope comes. Now, at first blush, that may seem a little odd because, come on, the computer knows which questions you got right or wrong, and therefore what your score is the moment you're finished and you get up and you walk out of the Prometric Center, right? It's not like this is new. The computer absolutely has your information. So why is it that they're going to wait to send you your result? Simple. This is all about security. This is all about making sure that everything in your testing situation was legitimate and good, and they're going to double check, they're going to compare, looking at some of the mathematics of the questions and so forth before they release your score. They've discovered once they let your score go, they can't get it back, so they're going to double check to make sure everything was right before the score is released. But 182, what does that actually mean? I mean, how do we interpret the scores that we get? Well, you get your scores for your Step 2 CK exam in not one but 2 separate metrics, a 3-digit score and a 2-digit score. I need to have you understand that you're not getting any additional information by getting these 2 numbers. These 2 numbers are merely giving you the same information on different measurement scales. I like to have people think about these 2 different ways of measuring your test performance as if they're temperatures like Fahrenheit or Celsius. So when I tell you the temperature in Fahrenheit, and at the same time I tell you the temperature in Celsius, I'm not giving you new information, I'm just, once again, the same information on 2 different scales. Basically what you're getting from your scores is just that, temperature. How hot or cold are you? Now, I know when you look at these scores, it looks like they mean a certain thing. It looks like if I say someone got a score of 218, that out of 370 questions, they got 218 questions right. That seems almost obvious. I know it looks like when you say you got an 88 in the 2-digit score, that looks like you got 88% of the questions right, or perhaps you might want to interpret that as the 88th percentile. All right, listen up. They don't mean that. The three-digit score does not tell you the number of questions you got right. You will never know the number of questions you got right. The two-digit score does not tell you the percentage of questions you got right, nor does it tell you the percentile. I know it really looks like that's what they mean, but it's not true. I get emails all the time from students, and they write and tell me, I took my Step 2 CK exam, here's the score I got, they say, a 93%. Okay, and my first line back to them is, no you didn't, you got a 93. There are no percentiles, there is no percent given as they give you the scores on your Step 2 CK exam. All you know is that higher numbers are better and lower numbers are worse. That said, you can use this information in order to get a sense of where you are relative to other people that take the exam. Now, I want you to understand some of the scoring issues, and I want to respond to some of the myths, the misinformation that I found are out there. I read this on the internet all the time. I hear this when students are discussing. So let me try to make sure that everyone's grounded in how the system actually works. First, I want to assure you that you're not graded against each other. This is not a test where we grade on the curve, and that is we look at how everybody scores and we give the top scores to the higher people and the worst scores to the lower people. This is an exam where once a year they set what the passing standard will be. And that passing standard is consistent all year and does not change. Think about the exam scoring not as a foot race in the Olympics where the first person across the line wins, but as a high jump where everybody that crosses the bar gets the score. We're not grading you against each other, we're grading you against a set of preset standards, the minimal competency standard that I mentioned to you before. That also means that international medical graduates and U.S. medical graduates are graded by the same standard using the same exam. It is not true that if you're an international medical graduate, you're being somehow disadvantaged by a comparison against the U.S. medical students. Everybody that takes the exam is scored the same way. Everyone that takes the exam is evaluated by the exact same criterion. I also want to make it clear that when you take the exam doesn't matter. There's a persistent rumor that certain months are better to take the exam than others, and I have to tell you once again, that's simply not the case. I hear from students all the time who are convinced that taking the exam in May and June and July is a really bad idea, because that's when a lot of U.S. medical students take the exam. And they assume they're being compared to the U.S. medical students, and they assume that's a harder group to beat. Once again, you're not being scored against each other, so stop thinking about beating somebody. Think about beating the standard that was preset. So let's be clear. If you take the exam a month when everybody else that takes the exam is an utter genius, it doesn't hurt you. If you take the exam a month where everyone else that takes the exam is a total idiot, it doesn't help you. Here's the standard, jump over the standard, and you get your score. That's how the process works. Now, all of that said and understood, you can use the information they give you that comes in your score report to get a sense of how you did relative to other people. You're not scored by just determining where you are to other people, but after the scores are in place, you can look back and get a sense of where other people are relative to you. We're going to do just a little bit of content from biostatistics here and have you use that to understand these numbers. Look at the three-digit score. I said the mean published was 218 with a standard deviation of roughly 23. That's supposed to be about 20, but it actually varies a little bit from year to year. Well, clearly, if you get a score of 218, you're on the mean. That means you're on the 50th percentile. That means you did better than half the people that took the exam, although another half of the people did better than you. If you're one standard deviation over the mean, look at the numbers here. Think 241, for example. That means you're at the 84th percentile. Simply using the percentages relative to standard deviations in any normal curve, we can reason through to where you are. If you're one standard deviation over the mean, it means you beat 84% of the people that took the exam. Now, that's a pretty good and a very competitive place to be. Only 16% of people who took the exam did better than you. You can see that you could do the same calculation using the mean and standard deviation for the two-digit score, because these two distributions map onto each other. You should get the exact same result, whichever distribution that you use. So with that understanding of the numbers, you now have a job in front of you. Your first job in getting ready for the exam is simple. Pick your number. Decide what score you're going to get in your exam. And please note, I didn't say decide what score you're going to try for. No, decide what score you're going to get. What I love to see is people pick that number and then get a blank sheet of white paper, a big black marker, and to write that number on the piece of paper and then paste it on your wall so it's the first thing you see every morning and the last thing you see every evening. Because as you go through the process, as you become fatigued with your studying, your preparation, nothing motivates you, nothing keeps you going quite so much as that number staring you back in the face. Pick your number. What number should you pick? Well, here's some suggestions. At least try to beat the mean. At least try to beat the mean because, well, if you're in the top half of all the people seeking a residency position, that's a pretty competitive position to be in. By recent data, just over 50% of international medical graduates seeking a residency position in a given year attain a position. So if you're in the top half of all the candidates by score, that means you're in a very good position in order to get yourself a residency for the coming year. If you're thinking about a specialty that's very competitive, well then you got to kick it up a notch. Think about 240. If you're in the 84th percentile, that's again a very competitive position. You beat 84% of the people, only 16% did better than you. That's a very good position to be in. What's the highest possible score? Yeah, it doesn't matter what the highest possible score is. Clearly, by just a basic understanding of statistics, once I'm 3 standard deviations over the mean, there's not a whole lot left in the distribution. 3 standard deviations over the mean is the 99.85 percentile. So if you want to approximate what the highest possible score is, think about 3 standard deviations over the presented mean. But frankly, getting the highest score is really not your goal here. The extra effort to get those few points to be the highest possible is probably not worth the blood and sweat it's going to take. Why? Let's understand how the USMLE scores are used. These are screening test scores that are going to be used by the program directors to decide who should get interviewed. In other words, these scores don't say yes or no, you get into the residency. These scores say you get to move on to the next step in the selection process for residency. Since your residency application goes in electronically, many program directors tell me they simply take students' data, put it into a database or spreadsheet, and then they hit sort for the USMLE Step 1 and Step 2 numbers. Therefore, they can see who are the people that are applying to their particular program that are the higher scores or the lower scores. And then they usually pick some cutoff number, and people above that number, those are the people whose application they pursue, and people below that number, those are the people whose application they simply ignore. What you need is not the highest possible score, in other words. What you need is a high enough score to make whatever that cutoff is. Now remember, that cutoff is going to vary from program to program and from specialty to specialty. There are no national norms as to what the number is. And sometimes the program director doesn't know what the cutoff score is going to be until they put that spreadsheet together and see who applied to the program for that year. What you need is not the highest possible score, but a good enough score. And I have to tell you, I can't think of a single program director once you're, maybe 2 standard deviations over the mean, 260, who won't talk to you. I'm telling you, the sweat it takes to get from 260 to 280 is simply bragging rights. There's really no practical value in terms of advancing your career there. So pick your number. The only number I will not let you pick is the following. I just want to pass. I just want to get 182. And the reason is, folks, just trying to pass is really trying not to fail. And life experience tells us that trying not to fail is pretty much a recipe for disaster. You don't do well in this exam by hoping it won't hurt you, or it's going to hurt you bad. You do well in this exam because you walk in, you're confident, you're going to grab the bull by the horns, you're going to wrestle it to the ground. You do well in this exam because you're walking in the room, you're a doctor, you deserve to be there. And this is where you demonstrate that you have the intelligence, the capacity, that you've done the preparation that it demanded in order to get the score. Pick your number. Pick your number and aim high. A high score means you have an easier time. A high score helps you confirm your sense of yourself as the good physician that you actually are.